This is Amplifying Autism, where every voice matters and every story shines. Join us as autistic authors, professionals, and trailblazers share their journeys, real stories, and real insight from those changing the world, one conversation at a time. I'm so excited to welcome to the podcast my friend, author Brendan Corbett. Brendan grew up in a military family, always on the move. Books, especially fantasy, were both stabilizing for him and the ultimate escape. Through books, he could visit other worlds and live with characters who stayed with him, even when he had to move again and leave friends behind. As an adult, he turned away from fantasy to more practical careers, from job shop operator to STEM curriculum director, Fortune 500 engineer to nonprofit director. Brendan discovered he was autistic in his 30s. And with this new self-knowledge, his wide range of experiences brought him back to his love of writing. His work includes the 4-book young adult series, The Rune Tree Chronicles, and his new 3-book series, The Quinates Faithful. He lives in Oregon with his wife, son, dog, and 2 new kittens. While writing and wrangling the critters in his life take up much of his time, you might also find him at one of his ever-growing list of hobbies, including cooking, gardening, woodworking, hiking, and archery. Welcome, Brendan Corbett. Well, Brendan, I'm delighted to welcome you to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here with you.
You know, the last time we talked, it has been a while. You had just finished your first book, and of course, my brain is going to falter on it. The Historian,
Yeah, The Thief and the Historian.
the
Yeah.
thief and the historian, and I loved it. Now I'm a
Thank you.
little slow on my reading for fun because I get busy, but I have got the next one in that series. And I just started it. And like the first one, I love the world that you create and the characters. It just really draws you in. So I
Thank
just
you.
wanted to recommend this series to our listeners. And many of our listeners, of our audience, are late diagnosed autistic people. And they grew up not knowing that they were autistic. And some of them are just now wondering, am I? And one thing I know about you is that you have not always known that you were autistic. You want to share about that?
Yes. So by not always known, I've only known I was autistic for I think about 4 or 5 years now, and so I'm in my late 30s. So I was well into my 30s by the time it's interesting. I was actually reflecting back on what made me even consider seeking diagnosis and having that thought. And I had gone for a long time and decided at a certain point in life, hey, I want to seek individual therapy. And so I started that process, which was immensely helpful for me. And then through that, my therapist had a thought of, you have this sense of curiosity around, self-awareness, and she had recommended a few resources, and some of those resources talked about neurodivergence. And then through that, I went down an unbelievable rabbit hole, which is, I guess, not surprising. I'm going after all the resources and learning and reading. And so there I was in my early 30s thinking, oh, I wonder if I am autistic. And then that became quite obsessive, I would say, for a little while in terms of that consuming thought. And um, I remember it was it felt difficult to start the process of diagnosis, not just because of the logistics and that most autistic professionals are working with children, but because it was one of those things where I almost didn't want to accept that. I grew up in the 90s, and there was a very different culture around neurodiversity. And when children were diagnosed with autism in the 90s, it was, I remember having parents who looked like their kid had died when they found out that their kid was autistic in that time frame. And um, part of that may have been the community that I was living in, but it was really interesting for me. I went into that process a little uncertain, but then coming out of that with you, it was, I don't know. At first, there was a sort of this oh duh kind of right. Like, this is like getting that diagnosis and having the discussion with you, and the resources you provided was very in many ways eye opening, but also, yeah, this is very obvious for me. This is kind of who I am. And what it did is it was empowering, in truth. After I had the diagnosis, some time to settle and some time to reflect, it was really empowering to be able to look back and think about how life had been, the challenges that I had faced, and frustrations with myself, and feelings of myself not being good enough at times, even just
Mm.
because I was having a hard time with things that people should have an easy time with. So it was extremely cathartic. And I don't know, I'm a big advocate and believer that coming of age can happen at any age. And for me, that was a really transformational period of time for me to be able to go through that process and really change as a person in a good way.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. Now, I know you really pivoted in your life as far as career, um,
Uh,
and that was a kind of a big pivot. Do you want to talk a little bit about your career journey?
Absolutely. So I started my career. I went into engineering school. I had done a robotics club in high school and thought, I was good at math. Sort of the typical process of a guidance counselor saying, okay, well you're doing really well in math and science, so we encourage you to go X, Y, or Z. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I followed that advice. Went into engineering school. I stayed on for a master's program. I started working in STEM education, and then I started working on clinical trials and I had this thought process of, hey, I want to go as high and fast as I can in a career and then retire early. It's almost like giving myself the grace to do the thing that I was not finding satisfactory, but then to get away from it quickly once I, financially stable or whatever the values I had at that time. So
Uh-huh.
I had gone from academic research, working as a research assistant, and then STEM education, and then making after school education and engineering spaces for kids. And then I jumped into clinical trials. After clinical trials, I went into manufacturing, which is kind of what I had studied for engineering. And then I shifted within a company from manufacturing into program management, and I was just the stress, the dissatisfaction, the lack of attachment to what I was doing really hit.
Mm.
And so, right around the time that I felt like I hit this wall, this professional wall of feeling like it's not so much that I couldn't handle the stress. I'd been in stressful jobs, but it wasn't
Yes.
fulfilling and it didn't have meaning for me. And like when you sit in a stressful situation and you can't find meaning for the stress, that's what became challenging. So I have an incredible partner, and she told me, she said, "Why don't you quit?" It was frankly the question she asked. I had this kind of a shock moment. I grew up in a Southern military Korean family where work is a huge part of identity, and that's a huge part of valuing who you are. And she said that to me, and I just kind of was floored. And it took me a few days to process that. Is this a statement of frustration? No, she really meant that and was supportive of that in terms of wanting to be healthy. Um, and so that kicked off the thought, well, I had thought for many years I wanted to work in nonprofits, and that, maybe that would be like a retirement thing. I would step away from corporate down the line. And um, I started sending out some feelers, and then I ended up working with a nonprofit for some time. And I've continued to consult with nonprofits. And it was interesting. I had this hope, and this was just before I had been diagnosed with autistic. I had this hope that, maybe this will be it, right? I'll find purpose and value in my work. It will make the stress and fatigue and the emotional and personal mental fatigue worth it. It'll be that situation where I can be like other people. I had a coworker who I really liked who was just did not mind just come in, sit down, grind on hard or like tedious work or hard work, whatever it happened to be, and then happy to step away in the day. I was like, I just don't feel that. So I thought maybe this will be it then. I'm stepping into nonprofits with a nonprofit that I love the mission of. And maybe this will be it. And the reality was it wasn't. It just didn't have uh, that fulfillment and that fatigue and that emotional and mental strain and stress. I was walking out every day feeling like I was kind of lost. And it didn't matter that work was going well. It didn't matter that the nonprofit was thriving at that time, that I was able to do a lot of good things there. Um, and around that time is when I said, well, I've been seeking escape. Lunch breaks after work and writing is kind of just a way to honestly run away from a lot of these problems and to find some space. Um, and I had gotten to where I had more or less packaged as a book. Sitting full time in that environment wasn't really doing it, obviously. And my partner asked the same question again. She said, "Why don't you quit?" And so I'm again eternally grateful for her support. And I really had that dawn on me moment. Well, I can find a different balance. And so I did step away from full-time work with a nonprofit, started doing some consulting part-time and writing in earnest. And so that was where I finally found like a space where there was a balance that made sense for me. That even when I'm consulting, if it's not my favorite thing always, and there's times when it doesn't feel fulfilling or positive in the way I want, I still can step back, and there's breathing room and agency that I have in this space that allows me to feel in control to a degree. That's very different than being a full-time. Yeah, there's drawbacks, of course. There's no perfect type of role, but that balance that I've been able to strike now has been really amazing. And I'm actually looking through another evolution, I guess a career evolution, where I'm saying, well, maybe I step away from nonprofits and I'm starting a food business. So I'm like, it's one of those things where I'm still in that process of finding and identifying, but writing really is that core of like the heart and soul of who I am. And it is, yeah, it's been that thing where I can sit down and write, and that idea of fatigue or that idea of lack of fulfillment, it doesn't really change. When I get a message from someone who says, hey, I really enjoyed this, it is far more transformational or impactful than going to a board meeting or a quarterly report where someone highlights some work you've done. It just doesn't have, it has a very different impact for me as a person. So um, yeah, I'm fortunate to have kind of meandered through a strange career to get myself to this stage where still
Yeah.
not necessarily the most refined career path, if that makes sense, but
And and it doesn't have to be, does it?
absolutely, yeah. And I think that's something that I really appreciated in the environment that I was raised in. It was very much, you have to have this, career plan, set your career goals. What's your next career step? Corporate ladder. That was very much the framing and mindset, and it's understandable. My dad came from a poor farming community, and my mom was a first generation naturalized to America and came from a poor farming community as well. And this idea of they wanted to see their kids succeed in ways that they couldn't or felt like they never had the opportunity to, but it was also a really important thing to realize that success is not the same for everyone, and values are not the same,
Yes.
and what success means. And so that
Yeah.
was a kind of a learning process that thankfully they came along for as a journey, and it's been healthy for them too to see.
I think that is amazing. Um, now, in your books, you talk about being able to like get lost in it, get away from the whole corporate thing, in writing of it. And one of the things that you're really good at is creating entire worlds with they have their own rules of what does it mean to be a historian. What kind of magic exists in your world that doesn't exist in our world or in some other author's world? Um, and I wonder, does it feel to you like, uh, does your autism, help you to be creative in that way and to just, uh, imagine, to it's kind of like you're jumping down a rabbit hole that did not exist until you went at it.
Absolutely, it's one of those things that at first a part of me wondered if it would be a hindrance more than a help. There was a part of me that had that just curiosity of oh, I'm starting to write and starting to spend more time in creative writing even before I had my diagnosis, and then afterwards, it's, well, I had some reflection on what does that mean, and I think a few of my early life experiences and sort of my coping mechanisms with the lack of support that I had kind of lended themselves to supporting writing and supporting creativity. In that, when I was a kid, I had to have an outlet, I had to have an escape, and I didn't have that because there was no diagnosis, there was no recognition of need, and so it's sort of just you're on your own. And one of the most important, if not the most important thing for me, was being able to read and reading fantasy books. I loved all sorts of different books, but really, I had this point in time I remember where a friend of mine was reading just a book set. We were in an elementary school, and so it was a book about elementary schoolers, and I just didn't like it. I started to read it and said I didn't like it, and he was surprised because he read a bunch of books too, and he was like, "Well, you read so much, why wouldn't you like this book?" And I was like, "It's too close to realness," and I didn't like reading something that felt like it was a realness that I didn't have or I couldn't experience in the same way. So a lot of the majority of books set in modern times are targeted towards a neurotypical reader, understandably. Neurotypical author, it's kind of what they know, but I didn't see my experiences in there. But when I jumped into fantasy books, Brian Jacques, the Redwall series, as an example, a mouse in this fantastical world. Yes, it's based on England. Yes, it has a lot of underpinnings of modern society. Yes, it has a lot of social commentary,
I
but
love that one. Yeah.
the set dressing, the rules are not the same. There was a freedom to not have to think of myself as myself. And I actually ended up finding myself gravitating towards, and this was a shock to my friends, I gravitated towards, especially since we were on military bases, I gravitated towards fantasy books with female protagonists because that was even just another layer of me being able to disconnect from who I am.
Yeah.
So if I'm the Sabriel series of by Garth Nix, those books, I could start reading that and truly disconnect and place myself in that world, because I didn't have to depend on who I am. Um, and so that was a large part of my escapism, being able to go
Mhm.
into these books and especially fantasy. And so then I came to, years down the line, come to adulthood. And when I started writing, I had that question of, is this more of a harm or a help? I think there's aspects of it that have been immensely helpful. A big part of it is I kind of tried to decide as an author. There's all these debates within fantasy writers of, do we have hard magic where every single rule and explicit things, and I'm going to write down every like intonation and how this works and the rules and this and that, and there's going to be measured quantities, and I'm going to have like the grams that you have to use of this thing for that part. And then there's people who say, well, we love Arthurian style where it is this mysterious thing where you never get a single explanation. And so my internal thought was, as an autistic person, and how I tried to process things in work, oftentimes in work, was to go to the extreme end of the detail. I can feel more confident if I hammer out every single aspect of detail, if I know every single little piece of everything. But then I realized the books that I'm enjoying reading are the other direction, very much more the more ethereal and less specific. And
Uh-huh.
so taking some time through that, I've kind of found what I consider to be a middle ground where I like systems that work. And part of this is also I was studied industrial engineering, which is all about systems and things shaping and working as a system and as a whole. And I want things to feel complete and meaningful, and I want them to be internally consistent, because that is, I have a hard time with books that change the rules as they go along, unless it's as
Oh,
a
yeah.
plot device. Um, so yeah, so the being able to reflect on my professional tendencies as an autistic person versus what I enjoy consuming helped me find where do I find satisfaction with how I write.
Mhm.
And so far, it seems like that's a pretty reasonable way. Readers seem to be reasonably happy with that kind of approach.
Yes.
It's the it's kind of a very central, even though I have two separate series and the worlds are completely different and the scale and style and approaches are very different. Um, I like leveraging that internalized desire for detail, but not overdoing it and saying, I have this, but I can leverage it in a way that's healthy for me for a reading experience where it will be internally consistent. It will be intentional. It will have rules, but I don't need to write the rules down for the reader, if that makes sense. I want the readers to experience
Yeah.
and get a sense that it makes sense or has a place. Um, so in that way, I'm kind of taking my autistic tendencies and my that little internal drive to write down a whole book of rules for something that no
Yeah.
one else is going to read, but then instead extracting what really matters for a reader, what matters for the story that I'm trying to tell. Um, and that also is kind of ties into the thought process, not just in world building, but in terms of character development. One of the things that I struggled with early on, I feel like I've gotten better with as I've written more, is the emotional aspect and emotional processing and characterization. And I have a peer, a friend who is also a writer, and she read one of my recent books and said, I want more. And I was like, well, you read my earlier books. This is more. And she made the comment of yes. And I mean, no, it feels like it's being held back. It's being held back. And we talked
Hmm.
about what ways. And she said, it's really just the emotional input. And we spent some time. It was great to workshop with a peer where she kind of showcased that as an autistic person, I had this tendency to say, I'm going to make a very short, punctuated, specific reference to sort of the internalized emotions or the status of a character, or make a light reference or allow the situation to carry it. But for readers, it was helpful to hear that that's not how a neurotypical reader is perceiving. They really want to sit in those emotions and live with it. And me, as an autistic
Mm.
person, historically had this tendency to, as soon as I could identify what the emotion or sensation was, either want to move away from it or move past it. And this is one of the things that I had referencing therapy, was working on in therapy, not avoiding emotion, but leaning into it and understanding. So I had that historical tendency to say, hey, I just want to either avoid this or move quickly as soon as I can, as soon as I've registered what's going on. Um, but if anything, it feels like that now that I have a good understanding of that tendency, it has been helpful because I can
Mhm.
easily define, or I go into these situations with intentionality. I have to go into situations with characters with intentionality around what's their emotional state. So then it's more of a matter of working on and improving my ability to say, okay, this is why this character is acting or feeling or doing what they're doing, but then how do we sit in that moment? And it's a really good
Mhm.
exercise to be able to kind of take that. So I guess
Yeah.
across the spectrum for writing, there is a I think as long as you're intentional with who you are and understanding and take some time to think through who you are and how your brain is working, and you're receptive to feedback from other people, from readers or peers, it's really helpful to have this kind of a mentality and to use that as a building block to write books. Uh, the other piece of it is most autistic people I know are um, very much enjoy observing, right? And that's a
Yeah.
tendency of mine where I can be very much satisfied, sit in a mall for 4 or 5 hours and watch people and just observe people.
Mhm.
And that is again one of those things where I have to dial it down in terms of descriptions and how much time is spent like slowing stories down for that. But um, there's that other aspect of just really enjoying falling into the details that helps, I think, helps bring the world alive when it's done well. And I'm still working on that balance of just how much to dive into things, but um, yeah, that's an
Well,
aspect of a general trend that I think is very helpful.
okay. Well, as a reader, I appreciate all the time that you put into creating the world and all the rules. Even if we don't read all the rules, you know the rules. So there's never a jarring moment where somebody uses a slang expression that we would be using in this world. It feels like we are completely in a world that is it is full and unique and different from ours. Well, a lot of us do look for something different. There's a lot
And I
of
think
readers, as you know.
that was one of the thoughts I had, I guess, as well. When we think about language, is autistic people spend a lot of time trying to mask and fit in, and
Yes.
I it was one of the things I had this in my career. I had this almost a personal policy of trying to listen very intentionally when I started a new job or started working in a new team. What was the jargon? What was the go-to phrase of positivity? How do you dissect the language? And so, as an example, I was in one job
Interesting.
where um, I moved into a new team, and the top compliment was to say something was stellar, and I was hyper specific to that group. It was not the same anywhere else in the company. It was just a little linguistic
Huh.
tick that had formed there. And so I spent time when I was there, if someone did something well, even though I was new in the group, I would say that was a stellar job. um, and that buys a lot
Interesting.
of goodwill very quickly. And so that same kind of mentality of, here I
Nice.
am spending a lot of time dissecting language because it was a tool for me to fit in and feel comfortable as a person and existing in these groups. Um, but I feel like it's something that I have benefited from now as an author, where it feels natural um, to take this interest in language and speech patterns and how did I fit in, and instead of trying to form it into a mold, more of creating a system that fits the narrative and the tone of the story.
Mhm. Now, a lot of our listeners are where you were 5 years ago. They're just either they just learned, oh, I'm autistic. What does that mean? Or they're just suspecting, could I be autistic? Um, what advice, now that you're a few years down the road from that, what advice would you give to people who are just coming to grips or to terms with their identity as an autistic person?
Yeah, it's actually really nice to look back at this question and think about myself at that stage and kind of how I ended up pursuing adult diagnosis and the result of that diagnosis. Um, I think one of the most important things is to remember that no one knows what it means to be you the way you know what it means to be you. And it may not be clear at this time. I know it wasn't clear for me in many ways, even 5 or 6 years ago, um, because I was grappling with uncertainties until I was able to really be certain of my identity, really, as an autistic person. And I think one of the most important things is to take the time to consider yourself which is not what autistic people generally think they can do. We think we have to take the time to consider the people around us and to think about how we need to react or mold or fit ourselves to match with the people around us as a masking technique. And so instead of doing that, was not fun at first, and does not feel great to do, is to take the time to reflect on yourself and give yourself that grace to consider who you are and what your values are, what your needs are, and what your wants are. What's important to you may not be the same when you take that time to reflect and to consider yourself and who you really are, as opposed to considering the interests of those people around you and who have been important in terms of framing yourself. And it's not that you have to disregard, or it's not that you're not going to honor and appreciate the people who've been around you, who you may have masked for unintentionally or intentionally. It's not to say that those people were not necessarily important or valuable. It's more to say, I think it's really important to reframe and consider yourself first for a little while, especially on the back of a diagnosis. Um, and once you've done that, it is incredibly freeing to consider and take that time and allow yourself to consider yourself and where you are, and not just the systems around you.
That is wonderful advice. Thank you. Now, before we say goodbye, I'm going to hold this up again. I love this cover.
Thank you.
This is great. And this is from the I'm sorry, the Rune Tree series. And I just have to say, sometimes I call my own children by their wrong name, and I love them all anyway. So if I get the name of the books wrong, I love it all the same.
Thank you.
But I know
I'm
this
a big
isn't your
advocate
only.
of say the names the way you like them. I've had people ask me, how do you pronounce this name? And I ask immediately, how do you imagine it being pronounced? So I'm a big
Yeah,
advocate of that. How it makes sense.
yeah. I have my own way of pronouncing all the character names. It's like when they first appear, it's like, what am I going to call them? Okay.
Yeah.
And then that's the way it is. But this is not your only series. So I don't know if you have one within hand reach to hold up, or if you just want to tell us some of your
Yeah, I
titles.
unfortunately don't at the moment, but I
That's
have
okay.
written a second series. I'm almost done with the second series. So the Rentry Chronicles is 4 books. That's all wrapped.
Mhm.
And the second series is called The Quinnet's Faithful. The third book will be coming out this summer, and that will be the third and final book in that series. It is, I feel, a step forward as a writer, which feels great, which I'm very proud of. But it's also a fantasy series, epic fantasy, very much a coming of age at its core, its heart and core. It's a much tighter and smaller world, so it's one of those things
Mm.
where I really enjoyed in the Rune Tree Chronicles creating something very vast and large and sort of meandering through, and then this time creating more punctuated, focused space,
Mhm.
but still trying to have
Interesting.
that sense of discovery and wonder. And so that series will be wrapped this summer, which is kind of
Oh,
exciting.
I'm looking forward to that. And how can people get in touch with you or find you and your books online, or where's the best way for them to follow you?
The best place really is my website, so authorbrendancorbett.com. And I also have an Instagram. It's also author Brendan Corbett. I'll be honest, I am a terrible millennial. I know I should be sharing there. It's not like it's some great sales channel. It's more to just share and be open. But I had a person who I met in person at a local author fair. They love the books, and then they reached out to me a few weeks ago and said, "Hey, are you still writing?" And I was like apologizing. I was like, "Oh, I'm
Yeah.
so sorry. This is where they were following." But it's I try to keep up on Instagram, but really joining the newsletter. I send out updates every month or two, and it includes writing
Yes.
updates, book releases, and personal updates too. So that really is the best way. We had some new kittens a year ago and some change ago,
Oh,
and I send out pictures of the cats with that. So if you like kittens, you'll see some kittens here and there. But yeah, so that's the best way. I was also going to mention,
yeah.
as kind of a thank you and a recognition of this community and the importance of it, if there's anyone who would like to see a sample of my books or writing, if you decide to sign up, and feel free to email me, and you can mention this podcast. I'll be happy to send a free ebook your way as well, just to
Oh,
as a thank you for this
wonderful.
community.
That is great. So I will put that in the show notes so that people can get their free book, and it will get them hooked
Yes.
because that's the way
Hopefully
you
so.
write.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Brendan. This has been a wonderful conversation. I've enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful to speak with you. It's been wonderful to see you again as well.
Same. Been a while.
It has, yeah, yeah, and it's always nice to be able to come back and thank someone who's been kind of transformational in my life
Oh,
and growth. And it
oh,
really, I don't know, having that diagnosis and having that confirmation, and again being able to take the steps I need to work on myself as a person focusing on myself as the priority, which feels strange to say. It really it has been freeing and empowering both. So I'm eternally grateful.
And your journey is such a good model for other people who are wondering, should I pivot? Should I quit my job? Should I do, what should I do? How should I be, to give themselves grace, as you mentioned. That's so important. And I hope when your next book comes out, get back in touch and be on the podcast again. We could do this for every book.
Absolutely.
I'd be happy.
Oh, I would love to come back. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And bye-bye. And thanks for listening to Amplifying Autism. I loved this conversation with Brendan Corbett. One new thing I learned about him was how his late diagnosis of autism helped him reflect on his life. It was cathartic for him and helped him a great deal on his journey of self exploration. Brendan reminds us that coming of age can happen at any age, and learning that you're autistic is an important life event. This self discovery and growth is a core element of both of his young adult fantasy series, The Rune Tree Chronicles and The Quinati Faithful. This was largely because books were one of his most important tools for self care, growing up without knowing that he was autistic. What Brendan is most excited about right now is wrapping up his current series, The Quinati's Faithful. He's rightfully proud of his work. He loves world building and crafting everything new for each new series. But now that he's wrapping up what will be about 1,000-page series, he's ready to dive into his next work. Although it will be fiction, it's personal rather than otherworldly. He's writing about generational trauma and his experience as a biracial Korean American. After polishing this work, he's already also working on his next fantasy series, merging elements of Korean culture and myth with his love of fantasy. Brendan left us with some words of advice for other late diagnosed autistic people. No one except you can know what it means to be you. As a person who wasn't diagnosed until his 30s, he says it's important to take time to think about what you want and need. He felt everything was a reflection of what other people expected of him. Brendan reminds you to give yourself the grace and time to think about who you are, what your values are, and how you want to live your life. It's incredibly freeing. Oh, one more thing. Brendan has a gift for you. If you sign up for his newsletter at author.brendancorbett.com and mention the Amplifying Autism podcast, he'll gift you a free ebook. I'm going to go sign up right now. Thank you for joining us in this fantastic conversation with author Brendan Corbett. I'm looking forward to his next book. If you enjoyed this episode of Amplifying Autism, please subscribe, leave a review, and share this with your friends and followers. Your support helps us reach more late diagnosed autistic adults, the people who care about them, and everyone who has wondered if they might be autistic themselves. I'm Wendell Whitcomb Marsh. Looking forward to next time. You've been listening to Amplifying Autism, celebrating the voices that shape a more understanding world. Don't miss the next episode. More stories, more insight, and more voices that matter.